He didn't just embarrass her. He violated her in front of the world's elite. Right there at the most luxurious wedding of the season, in front of diplomats, cameras, and 400 of the most powerful people in the nation, Edric Vale grabbed his pregnant ex-wife's gown and ripped it open, exposing her belly to humiliate her. He wanted to break her spirit, to prove she was nothing, to erase the woman who had built his entire career. But what Aurora Hemsley did next, what she revealed in that moment of brutal public shame, didn't just destroy his wedding. It detonated his political future and exposed the monster behind the polished smile. And that was only the beginning of his fall. Hello, my friends. Welcome to today's story. Before we begin, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Also, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Nairobi, Atlanta, Sydney, Toronto? We love hearing from you, and your support keeps these stories coming. Now, let me take you back. Back before the torn gown, before the cameras flashed on her shame, before the world knew her name. Back to when Aurora Hemsley believed in a man who didn't deserve the ground she walked on. Once upon a time, in a city filled with old libraries and government buildings where power whispered through marble hallways, there lived a young woman named Aurora Hemsley. She was 24 years old, soft-spoken, with warm brown eyes that always seemed to be reading something even when no books were present. Aurora worked as a junior archivist at the National Historical Society, a prestigious institution housed in a building that smelled of old paper, leather bindings, and centuries of preserved secrets. Her job was to catalog documents, restore fragile manuscripts, and help researchers find needles in haystacks of historical records. She earned just enough to rent a small studio apartment above a bakery, where the smell of fresh bread woke her every morning. Her life was quiet, solitary, but it was hers. She had her books, her work, and a deep belief that if you were patient and kind, good things would eventually find you. And then one autumn afternoon, good things walked through the archive doors in the form of Edric Vale. Edric was 26 years old, a junior diplomatic intern at the Foreign Relations Office, and he was desperate. He had been assigned to research historical trade agreements for a presentation his supervisor would deliver to the Minister's Council, but he had no idea where to start. He was tall, with deep brown skin, close-cropped hair, and eyes that darted around nervously as if constantly calculating his next move. When he approached Aurora's desk that day, he was sweating through his cheap suit, clutching a wrinkled notepad, looking like a man drowning in expectations he couldn't meet. Aurora looked up from a 200-year-old shipping manifest she was restoring and saw not a polished professional, but a young man who needed help. So she helped him. She spent 3 hours that afternoon guiding him through the archives, pulling documents, explaining contexts, even writing notes in simpler language so he could understand the complex historical frameworks. When Edric left that evening, he had everything he needed for his presentation. He also had Aurora's kindness etched into his memory. He came back the next week, and the week after that. And soon, he wasn't just coming for research help. He was coming for her. Edric Vale was charming in that hungry way that people are when they want something desperately and know that wanting it isn't enough. He was the youngest son in a family of 5 brothers, all of whom had become doctors, engineers, accountants, respectable men with respectable lives. Edric had chosen politics, a field where your last name and your connections mattered more than your talent, and he had neither. His father had been a postal worker. His mother cleaned houses for wealthy families in the suburbs. Edric had clawed his way into university on scholarships and loans, then fought for an unpaid internship that barely gave him access to the rooms where decisions were made. He was 26 years old and still sleeping on his brother's couch, still wearing suits from discount stores, still watching men younger and less capable than him rise simply because their fathers made phone calls. Edric wanted to matter. He wanted to be somebody. And when Aurora looked at him with those warm, believing eyes and told him he was brilliant, that he just needed guidance and opportunity, something in him latched onto her like a lifeline. They started dating 3 months after they met. Aurora had never had a serious relationship before. She had spent her teenage years taking care of her sick grandmother, then her early 20s building her career, always too busy or too shy to put herself out there. Edric was her first real love, and she gave herself to him completely. She believed in him with a faith that was almost religious. When he talked about his dreams, about becoming a junior attaché, then a senior diplomat, maybe one day a minister who could actually change policies and help people, Aurora didn't just listen. She strategized with him. She mapped out his career path, identified the skills he needed, the connections he had to make, the image he had to project. And she sacrificed for him. 6 months into their relationship, Edric's internship ended and he couldn't find paid work. His applications to every diplomatic position were rejected. He was drowning in student loan debt and had no network to pull him up. So Aurora took on a second job. During the day, she worked at the archives. In the evenings, she tutored university students in history and research methods, charging £30 an hour, cycling across the city on a second-hand bicycle to meet students in coffee shops and libraries. At night, she transcribed legal documents for a transcription service that paid by the word. She worked 16-hour days, 7 days a week, and every penny she didn't need for rent and food went to Edric. She paid for him to enroll in a graduate program in international relations at Kensington University, a prestigious school that would give him the credentials he lacked. The tuition was £15,000 a year. Aurora had £8,000 saved from 3 years of work. She took out a loan for the rest, signing paperwork that would take her a decade to pay off. While Edric studied, Aurora kept working. She stayed up late rewriting his essays because his writing was competent but not exceptional, and exceptional was what he needed to stand out. She coached him before presentations, teaching him how to slow down his speech, make eye contact, project confidence even when he felt none. She bought him a proper suit from a consignment shop, had it tailored to fit him perfectly, because she understood that in rooms filled with privilege, appearance was currency. On the night before Edric's thesis defense, Aurora stayed awake until 4 in the morning helping him rehearse his answers to potential questions from the review board. She made him tea, rubbed his shoulders when tension made them rigid, and told him over and over that he was ready, that he was brilliant, that they would see what she saw in him. He passed with distinction. 2 months later, he proposed to her in their tiny shared apartment, a one-bedroom flat they had moved into together after Edric graduated. It wasn't a grand proposal. He didn't have money for an expensive ring. He gave her a simple silver band with a small stone that caught the light when she moved her hand. But Aurora didn't care about the ring. She cared that this man she loved, this man she believed in, wanted to build a life with her. She said yes before he even finished asking the question. They married in a small civil ceremony with just a handful of friends present. Aurora wore a simple cream dress she had found at a charity shop. Edric wore the suit she had bought him. They couldn't afford a honeymoon, so they spent their wedding night in their apartment, eating takeaway food and talking about the future they would build together. Aurora had never been happier. And then Edric's career finally started moving. 3 months after their wedding, Edric was offered a position as a junior attaché in the Economic Development Division of the Foreign Relations Office. It was entry-level, barely above an internship in terms of prestige, but it was paid. It was official. It was a foothold. Edric was ecstatic. Aurora was proud. She framed his official appointment letter and hung it on their living room wall like it was a diploma. But the position paid only £28,000 a year, barely enough to cover their rent and loan payments. So Aurora kept working multiple jobs. She took on weekend shifts at the archives. She increased her tutoring hours. And when her grandmother passed away and left Aurora a modest inheritance of £30,000, money that was meant to be a safety net or a down payment on a house someday, Aurora didn't hesitate. She gave it to Edric to fund his first political campaign. Edric wanted to run for a position as junior trade representative, an elected role within the Foreign Relations Office that would give him more visibility, more access, more power. The campaign required money for materials, events, networking dinners with people who could endorse him. Aurora's inheritance paid for all of it. She watched her grandmother's life savings, money earned from 40 years of nursing work, disappear into glossy flyers and catered receptions. But she told herself it was an investment in their future, in the life they were building together. Edric won the position. And with that win, everything changed. Suddenly, Edric was being invited to events Aurora couldn't attend because they were for officials only. He was traveling to conferences in other cities, other countries, meeting diplomats and ministers and people whose names appeared in newspapers. He started dressing differently, speaking differently, carrying himself with a confidence that no longer seemed borrowed. The awkward, desperate young man who had walked into the archives 4 years ago was gone, replaced by someone polished, self-assured, ambitious in a way that felt less like dreaming and more like calculation. Aurora told herself she was happy for him. This was what they had worked for. This was the plan. But somewhere in the back of her mind, in a place she didn't want to examine too closely, she noticed that Edric stopped asking for her help with his speeches. He stopped telling her about his day in detail. When she suggested they go out for dinner to celebrate his wins, he was too tired, too busy, too focused on the next goal. Their conversations became shorter, more transactional. He would come home late, eat whatever she had prepared, scroll through his phone reading messages from colleagues and contacts, then fall asleep without really seeing her. Aurora tried not to mind. She tried to be patient. She told herself that once he was more established, once the pressure eased, they would reconnect. She kept working her 3 jobs, kept paying the bills, kept holding down the foundation of their life so he could reach higher. And then, after 4 years of marriage, after years of Aurora pouring everything she had into building Edric into someone powerful, something unexpected happened. Aurora got pregnant. She had been trying for 2 years. She had gone through fertility tests, treatments, medications that made her body ache and her emotions swing wildly. She had cried through negative test after negative test, each one feeling like another door closing. Edric had been supportive at first, but as the attempts continued without success, he started saying things like maybe it's not the right time or maybe we should take a break from trying. Aurora knew what he really meant. He meant that a child would complicate his rise, would make him look less available, less flexible, less like the kind of man who could drop everything for a last-minute diplomatic trip. But Aurora wanted a child. She wanted a family. She wanted something that was hers and his together, something that wasn't just about his career. So when she saw those 2 pink lines on the pregnancy test one cold morning in November, she cried tears of pure joy. She was 28 years old, married to a man she loved, finally going to be a mother. She imagined telling Edric, imagined his face lighting up, imagined them planning a nursery in their small apartment, imagined their child growing up knowing they were wanted and loved. She decided to tell him somewhere special, not in their apartment where he was always distracted. She made a reservation at a small cafe near the archives, the same cafe where they had spent hours talking in the early days of their relationship. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Edric had agreed to meet her, though he had warned her he only had 30 minutes before a meeting. Aurora sat across from him in the cafe, hands wrapped around a cup of tea she wasn't drinking, and told him the news. "I'm pregnant. We're going to have a baby." She watched his face. She watched hope die in real time. Edric's expression didn't light up. It didn't soften. It went completely blank, like a mask sliding into place. He stared at her for what felt like an eternity, then said, "We need to talk about timing." Aurora's stomach dropped. She said, "Timing?" Edric leaned forward, his voice low, controlled. "Aurora, I'm in the middle of the most important phase of my career. The deputy minister position is opening up in 6 months. I'm on the shortlist. But they want someone who can travel, who can work 80-hour weeks, who doesn't have complications." Complications. He called their baby a complication. Aurora said, her voice shaking, "This baby isn't a complication, Edric. This is our child." Edric rubbed his face, suddenly looking tired and irritated. "Look, I know you want this. But you have to understand what this means for me. For us. If I get the deputy minister position, we'll have everything. Money, security, status. But I can't get there if I'm tied down right now." Tied down. As if she and their child were anchors, not family. Aurora felt anger rising in her chest, sharp and hot. "I've supported you for 4 years, Edric. I've worked myself to exhaustion. I gave you my grandmother's inheritance. I rewrote your papers, coached you, believed in you when no one else did. And now that I need something, now that we're creating a life together, you call it being tied down?" Edric's eyes went cold. "I didn't ask you to do those things. You chose to. And now you're choosing to have this baby at the worst possible time. So if you want to go through with this, that's your choice. But don't expect me to sacrifice everything I've built." Aurora felt like she had been slapped. She said, "Are you asking me to terminate the pregnancy?" Edric didn't answer directly. He just said, "I'm asking you to think about what's best for everyone." Aurora stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. Several people in the cafe turned to look. She said, her voice trembling with fury and heartbreak, "This baby is what's best for me. If you can't see that, then maybe you need to think about what kind of man you've become." She left the cafe. Edric didn't follow her. That night, he didn't come home. Aurora sat in their apartment, one hand on her still flat stomach, crying until she had no tears left. She told herself he just needed time to adjust, that he was scared, that he would come around once the shock wore off. But 2 weeks later, Aurora came home from work to find legal documents on the kitchen table. Petition for divorce. Edric Nathaniel Vale versus Aurora Marie Hemsley Vale. Grounds: irreconcilable differences and incompatible life goals. Aurora read the words over and over, trying to make them make sense. She had been married for 4 years. She was pregnant with their child. And her husband was divorcing her by leaving papers on the table like a bill she needed to pay. When Edric finally came home that evening, Aurora was still sitting at the table, the divorce papers in front of her. She looked at him and said simply, "Why?" Edric didn't sit down. He stood in the doorway, briefcase in hand, looking at her like she was a problem he needed to solve efficiently. "Aurora, I can't do this. I can't be who I need to be with you in my life. You're from a different world. You don't understand the circles I'm moving in now. You don't have the education, the polish, the connections. And now with a baby? I'd be finished before I even really started." Aurora felt something inside her crack. She said, "I built you. I made you who you are." Edric's expression hardened. "No, Aurora. You helped. But I'm the one who did the work. I'm the one with the degree, the position, the talent. You were support staff. That's all. Support staff. For years of marriage, of love, of sacrifice, reduced to a job description." Aurora looked at this man she had loved, had believed in, had poured herself into, and realized she didn't know him at all. Or maybe she did know him, and had been willfully blind. This coldness, this calculation, this cruelty, it had probably always been there, hidden under charm and need. Now that he didn't need her anymore, he didn't have to hide it. She signed the divorce papers that night. Not because she wanted to, but because she understood that fighting a man who had powerful lawyers and important friends while she was pregnant and exhausted would destroy what little she had left. The divorce was brutal. Edric's lawyers were expensive, connected, and ruthless. Aurora could barely afford a legal aid attorney who was handling 50 other cases simultaneously. Edric's team argued that all the money Aurora had given him during their marriage had been gifts, not investments. They argued that the apartment they lived in, which Aurora had co-signed for but which was primarily in Edric's name, should go to him because he needed it for work purposes. They argued that Aurora's inheritance, which she had given to Edric for his campaign, had been a donation to his political efforts and therefore wasn't marital property subject to division. The judge, an older man who seemed bored by the whole proceeding, ruled in Edric's favor on almost every point. Aurora walked away from her marriage with nothing. No money, no apartment, no security. Just a baby growing inside her and a debt of £18,000 from the student loans she had taken out for Edric's education, loans that were in her name only. She moved out of their apartment on a rainy Saturday in March, 6 months pregnant, carrying her belongings in 3 suitcases and 2 boxes. Edric wasn't there. He had scheduled an important conference that weekend, or so he claimed. Aurora wondered if he had scheduled it deliberately to avoid facing her, avoid seeing the human cost of his ambition. She found a studio flat in a rough neighborhood on the other side of the city, the kind of place where you could hear your neighbors arguing through thin walls and where the hallway always smelled like old cooking grease and mildew. The rent was £600 a month, which was all she could afford. The flat was tiny, barely larger than a closet, with a window that looked out onto a brick wall and a bathroom so small you had to stand sideways to close the door. Aurora stood in the middle of that empty studio on her first night, surrounded by boxes she was too tired to unpack, and tried not to think about how far she had fallen. A year ago, she had been married, hopeful, building something. Now she was alone, broke, pregnant, and living in a place that felt like giving up. But she couldn't give up. She had a child coming. So she unpacked her boxes, made the studio as livable as she could, and started applying for jobs. Except no one was hiring. Her old position at the National Historical Society had been filled while she was dealing with the divorce. Other archives and museums sent polite rejection emails. "We've decided to move forward with other candidates. Thank you for your interest." She applied to 40 positions over 3 months. She got 2 interviews. Both ended with sympathetic smiles and no offers. She suspected Edric's influence, though she couldn't prove it. He moved in tight circles with people who sat on cultural boards, who funded institutions, who made calls on behalf of their colleagues. If he wanted to make sure Aurora didn't work in her field again, all he had to do was mention to a few key people that she was difficult, unprofessional, unstable. In a small professional world, rumors moved faster than truth. By the time Aurora was 8 months pregnant, she had 847 pounds in her bank account. That was all that stood between her and complete destitution. She had applied for public assistance, but the bureaucracy moved slowly and she was still waiting for approval. She rationed her food, buying the cheapest groceries she could find, skipping meals to save money. Her body ached constantly. Her feet were swollen. Her back hurt so much she could barely sleep. She felt exhausted all the time, that bone-deep exhaustion that comes from carrying a child while also carrying the weight of abandonment and poverty and fear about the future. She had no friends left to call. During her marriage to Edric, he had slowly, systematically isolated her from the few friends she had. He would make comments about how they were holding her back, how they didn't understand her new life, how they were jealous of her success. Aurora had believed him, or at least hadn't fought back, and so she had let friendships fade. Now, when she needed support the most, she had no one. Her phone rarely rang. Her messages went unanswered. She was alone in a way that felt absolute. One Tuesday morning, 8 months pregnant and feeling like she was running out of options, Aurora checked her email and found something unexpected. A message from someone called P. Moreland, event coordinator, representing Ashford Heritage Consultancy. The subject line read, "Urgent archival consultation needed, Marbridge Estate event." Aurora opened the email with the kind of desperate hope that comes from having no other options. "Dear Miss Hemsley, we are organizing a high-profile heritage celebration at Marbridge Estate and require an experienced archivist for a 3-day consultation beginning this Friday. The project involves cataloging historical memorabilia, organizing archival displays, and preparing materials for presentation to distinguished guests. The compensation is £5,000 for the 3-day period, plus accommodation and meals on site. Given your reputation and expertise, we believe you would be an excellent fit for this project. Please respond at your earliest convenience to confirm your availability. Sincerely, P. Moreland, Event Coordinator, Ashford Heritage Consultancy." Aurora read the email 3 times. £5,000. That was more money than she had seen in 6 months. That was rent for 8 months. That was food and baby supplies. That was breathing room. But something felt off. She hadn't worked in archives for months. How did they know her reputation? Why was this so urgent? Why was the pay so high for what sounded like basic cataloging work? She Googled Ashford Heritage Consultancy. The website looked professional enough, sleek and minimal, claiming they specialized in curating historical events for private estates and corporate clients. She Googled Marbridge Estate and found images of a sprawling historic manor surrounded by gardens, a place that looked like it belonged in a period drama. She Googled P. Moreland and found nothing, which wasn't necessarily suspicious. Event coordinators weren't usually public figures. Aurora sat at her tiny kitchen table, one hand on her pregnant belly, staring at the email. Every instinct she had told her something was wrong. The timing was too convenient. The pay was too generous. The vagueness about what the heritage celebration actually was, it all felt designed to get her there without giving her enough information to make an informed decision. But she had 847 pounds in her account and a baby coming in 4 weeks. She couldn't afford instincts. She couldn't afford caution. She replied to the email. "I am available and would be honored to assist with this project. Please send additional details and I will confirm my attendance." The response came back in less than 10 minutes. Too fast. As if someone had been waiting for her reply. "Excellent. A train ticket will be sent to your address tomorrow. Please arrive at Marbridge Estate by 4 p.m. on Friday. Dress professionally. Further details will be provided upon your arrival." Aurora felt unease creeping up her spine. But she pushed it down. She needed this job. She needed this money. She would go, she would do the work, and she would come home with enough money to survive a few more months. On Friday morning, Aurora dressed in the only professional outfit that still fit her pregnant body, a royal purple dress with an empire waist that flowed over her belly, hiding some of the swelling in her feet, making her look almost elegant despite everything. She packed a small overnight bag with toiletries, a change of clothes, and a book she wouldn't have time to read, but brought anyway out of habit. Then she took a bus to the train station, clutching the ticket that had arrived at her flat the day before in a cream-colored envelope with no return address. The train ride took 3 hours. Aurora sat by the window, watching the city give way to suburbs, then countryside, fields and forests stretching out in shades of green and gold under an overcast sky. She tried to read her book but couldn't focus. Her mind kept circling back to the email, to the strangeness of this job, to the feeling that she was walking into something she didn't understand. When the train pulled into the station nearest Marbridge Estate, a car was waiting. A driver in a black suit held a sign with her name on it. He didn't speak, just took her bag and opened the car door. They drove for another 20 minutes down narrow country roads lined with trees, until finally the estate came into view. Marbridge Estate was breathtaking in a way that felt almost violent. It was massive, a sprawling manor house built from pale stone, with dozens of windows reflecting the gray sky, ivy climbing the walls, gardens stretching out in every direction. There were marble fountains, manicured hedges, pathways lined with roses. It looked like the kind of place where history had been made, where power lived and breathed and entertained itself. The car pulled up to the front entrance. Aurora climbed out, her body stiff from travel, her purple dress catching the breeze. A woman in a neat gray uniform stood waiting at the entrance, an older woman with kind eyes and a worried expression. "Miss Hemsley? Welcome to Marbridge Estate. I'm Margaret, head of household staff. Let me show you to your workspace." Margaret's voice was gentle, but there was something in her eyes that Aurora couldn't quite read. Pity? Concern? Aurora followed her through the entrance into a grand foyer with marble floors, crystal chandeliers, walls covered in oil paintings of people who looked important and long dead. The air smelled like expensive flowers and furniture polish. As they walked deeper into the estate, Aurora started noticing things that made her stomach tighten. White flowers everywhere, massive arrangements of roses and lilies. Tables being set up in what looked like a ballroom. Champagne bottles and ice buckets. A massive guest list on a bulletin board that she glimpsed as they passed a planning room. Aurora stopped walking. She turned to Margaret and said, her voice tight with growing dread, "What kind of heritage celebration is this?" Margaret stopped too. She didn't turn around immediately. When she did, her face was full of something that looked like guilt. She said, very quietly, "It's not a celebration, dear. It's a wedding." Aurora's heart started pounding. She said, "Whose wedding?" Margaret hesitated, then said, "Mr. Vale's wedding. Edric Vale. He's marrying Miss Seraphine Dalloway tomorrow evening." The world tilted. Aurora grabbed the wall to steady herself, her vision blurring at the edges. She heard Margaret's voice as if from a great distance, asking if she was all right, if she needed to sit down. But Aurora couldn't sit down. She couldn't breathe. She was at Edric's wedding. He had brought her here. He had engineered this entire thing. The job offer, the generous pay, the vague details. It was all designed to get her here, broke and pregnant, forced to watch him marry someone else, someone appropriate, someone from his new world. Aurora looked around at the white flowers, the champagne, the preparations for a celebration of love. And she understood that this wasn't just about him moving on. This was about him finishing what he started when he divorced her. This was about erasing her completely, about proving that she meant nothing, that she had always meant nothing. Margaret touched her arm gently. "I'm so sorry, dear. I didn't know you didn't know. I'll help you leave if you want. I can arrange transport back to the station right now." Aurora stood there, one hand pressed against the wall, the other on her belly where her baby was moving, kicking as if sensing her distress. She could leave. She should leave. This was cruel and humiliating, and she didn't have to stay. But then she thought about the £5,000 she desperately needed. She thought about the train ticket she couldn't afford to waste. She thought about Edric, smiling and polished in his expensive suit, expecting her to run away, expecting her to disappear quietly into poverty and obscurity while he married his perfect bride and built his perfect life. And something in Aurora's chest hardened. She looked at Margaret and said, her voice steadier than she felt, "Show me where I'm supposed to work. I came here to do a job. So I'll do the job." Margaret looked at her with a mixture of admiration and sadness. Then she nodded and led Aurora to a small room off the main library, a space filled with boxes of documents, photographs, awards, all the pieces of Edric's carefully curated history. Aurora stood in that room, surrounded by evidence of a life she had built, but that no longer included her, and she knew that the next 2 days would be the hardest of her life. But she also knew, with a certainty that felt like steel forming in her bones, that she would survive them. And maybe, just maybe, she would find a way to make Edric regret ever thinking he could destroy her. #Chapter 2. Aurora spent the rest of that Friday afternoon in the small archive room, her hands shaking as she opened box after box of carefully curated materials that told the story of Edric Vale's rise to power. There were photographs of him at diplomatic conferences, shaking hands with ministers and ambassadors. There were framed certificates and awards, letters of commendation from important people whose signatures looked like they belonged on currency. There were newspaper clippings with headlines like Rising Star in Foreign Relations and the Future of British Diplomacy. Every single image, every single document, told the story of a self-made man who had clawed his way up from nothing through brilliance and determination. Aurora was nowhere in any of it. She had been erased so completely it was as if she had never existed. In one photograph, she recognized a award ceremony she had attended with Edric 3 years ago. She remembered standing beside him that night, wearing a dress she had saved for months to buy, watching him accept recognition for a policy paper she had helped him research and write. In the photograph on display, Edric stood alone at the podium, the space beside him empty, cropped out, as if the photographer had simply decided that whoever had been standing there didn't matter enough to include. She understood then that this wasn't just about replacing her. It was about rewriting history itself, creating a narrative where she had never been part of his story at all. Margaret checked on her twice that afternoon, bringing tea and biscuits that Aurora couldn't eat because her stomach was twisted in knots. The older woman didn't ask questions, didn't offer sympathy, just placed the tea on the desk and said quietly, "If you need anything, anything at all, you find me." Aurora nodded, not trusting herself to speak without crying. As evening approached, the estate became busier. Aurora could hear voices in the hallways, laughter, the sound of furniture being moved and decorations being adjusted. The wedding rehearsal was happening somewhere in the building, and the energy of it filled the air like electricity. Aurora kept her head down, kept cataloging, kept her hands busy so her mind wouldn't spiral into the horror of where she was and what was happening. At 7 o'clock, there was a knock on the door. Aurora looked up, expecting Margaret. Instead, a woman stood in the doorway, and Aurora's breath caught. She was stunning. Tall and elegant, with rich brown skin that seemed to glow in the soft light, her hair styled in an intricate updo adorned with delicate gold pins. She wore an ivory dress that looked expensive and effortless, the kind of dress that announced wealth without shouting. Her smile was warm and genuine, the kind of smile that made you want to trust her immediately. "You must be the archivist," she said, stepping into the room. "I wanted to thank you personally for helping preserve Edric's legacy. I'm Seraphine. Seraphine Dalloway, the bride." Aurora was looking at the woman Edric had chosen to replace her. Aurora stood up quickly, too quickly, and felt dizzy. She steadied herself against the desk. "It's nice to meet you," she managed to say, her voice coming out smaller than she intended. Seraphine moved closer, her eyes kind and curious. She looked at Aurora, really looked at her, and her gaze dropped to Aurora's pregnant belly. Her expression softened into something that looked like genuine concern. "Your baby must be due soon. How wonderful." She paused, then asked gently, "Do you have support? Family?" The question was so kind, so sincerely meant, that Aurora felt tears threatening. She blinked them back. "I'm managing alone." Seraphine's face filled with sympathy. "No one should go through pregnancy alone. If you need anything this weekend, anything at all, please find me. I mean that." Aurora nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She studied Seraphine's face, searching for cruelty, for smugness, for any sign that this woman knew who Aurora was and was enjoying her pain. But there was nothing. Seraphine's kindness was real. She had no idea that she was standing in a room with the woman her future husband had discarded like trash. Seraphine touched Aurora's shoulder lightly. "I should get back to the rehearsal dinner, but truly, if you need anything, I'm here." She smiled again, that warm, genuine smile, and left the room. Aurora stood there for a long time after Seraphine was gone, feeling something dark and complicated twisting in her chest. She had wanted the bride to be cruel, shallow, someone easy to hate. But Seraphine was kind. Seraphine was good. Which meant Seraphine was walking into a marriage with a man who was neither of those things, and she had no idea. Aurora sat back down and tried to focus on her work, but her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She kept thinking about Seraphine's question. "Do you have support?" No. She didn't. She had no one. And the man who should have been supporting her, the father of her child, was in this very building right now, rehearsing vows with another woman. At 8:30, Margaret appeared in the doorway again. Miss Hemsley, Mr. Vale has requested to see you in the library. Aurora's blood turned cold. She said, "Can I refuse?" Margaret looked pained. "I don't think that would be wise, dear. He's very insistent." Aurora stood up slowly, her whole body tense with dread. She followed Margaret through the estate's hallways, past rooms filled with laughter and celebration, until they reached the library. It was massive, a cathedral of books with floor-to-ceiling shelves, leather chairs, the smell of old paper and wood polish. Large windows looked out onto gardens that were dark now, lit only by path lights that made everything look like a stage set. Edric stood by one of the windows, his back to her, hands clasped behind him. He was wearing an expensive suit, charcoal gray with sharp lines that made him look powerful and untouchable. He didn't turn around when she entered. The silence stretched out, deliberate, a power play. Finally, he turned. His face was exactly as she remembered, handsome and polished, but his eyes were cold. When he smiled, it didn't reach those eyes. "Aurora," he said, as if greeting an old acquaintance. "You look exactly as I expected." Aurora stayed near the door, one hand instinctively moving to her belly. She didn't speak. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Edric walked slowly around her, appraising her like a piece of furniture he was considering buying. "I'm glad you came. I wanted you to see this. See what I became without you dragging me down." Aurora's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice level. "Why did you bring me here, Edric?" He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and sharp. "Because I wanted you to understand your place. You spent years thinking you were essential to my success, that you built me. But look around, Aurora. Look at where I am. Look at who I'm marrying. I did all of this after I left you. Which means you were never the reason for my success. You were just dead weight I had to cut loose to rise." Each word was designed to wound, and they did. But Aurora had spent 6 months living with his betrayal. She had cried until she had no tears left. His cruelty wasn't shocking anymore. It was just sad. She said quietly, "You're wrong. I was essential. I paid for your education. I funded your campaign. I wrote your speeches. I made you who you are. And you know it. That's why you erased me from every photograph, every document, every piece of your history. Because if people knew the truth, they'd see you for what you are." Edric's smile sharpened into something cruel. "And what am I, Aurora? A man who takes and takes and takes, and then destroys the people who loved him when he's done using them." Edric laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You really believe that, don't you? You really think you're some tragic victim in this story. But the truth is, Aurora, you were always temporary. You were practice. A starter wife. Someone to use until someone better came along. And Seraphine is better. She's educated, connected, elegant. She fits into my world. You never did." Aurora felt the words like physical blows. But she forced herself to stand straight, to not let him see how much he was hurting her. She said, "Does Seraphine know you were married before?" Edric's expression flickered, just for a moment, something that might have been worry. Then the mask was back in place. "What Seraphine knows or doesn't know is none of your concern. So she doesn't know. You lied to her. I protected her from irrelevant information. Our marriage was a mistake that I corrected. There's no reason to burden her with my past." Aurora looked at this man she had loved and realized she was looking at a stranger. Or maybe she was seeing him clearly for the first time. She said, "I feel sorry for her. She thinks she's marrying someone honest." Edric stepped closer, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "You will not speak to Seraphine. You will not tell her anything about our past. Do you understand me? Or what?" Edric pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket and placed it on the desk beside them. "Or I will make sure every door in your professional field closes permanently. I have friends now, Aurora. Important friends. People who sit on boards, who control funding, who make decisions about who gets hired and who doesn't. One word from me and you'll never work in archives again. You'll never work anywhere that requires a background check or a professional reference." He tapped the envelope. "But I'm not without mercy. Inside is £10,000. More money than you'll see in years. Take it. Work your 3 days. Keep your mouth shut. Then disappear. Go back to whatever sad little life you've built and stay there." Aurora looked at the envelope. £10,000. It was enough to survive for months. Enough to give her baby a chance. But taking it felt like selling the last piece of herself that Edric hadn't already stolen. She said, "And if I don't take it?" Edric's eyes went dead. Then I'll destroy you. Completely. You're already broke, already alone, already 8 months pregnant with no prospects. How hard do you think it would be to push you the rest of the way into nothing? Aurora felt fear crawling up her spine. She understood in that moment that Edric wasn't just cruel. He was dangerous. He had become someone who would crush anyone who threatened the image he had built. She forced herself to meet his eyes. She said, "I'll think about it." Edric smiled, as if her hesitation was already a victory. "You have until Sunday morning. Make the right choice, Aurora. For once in your life, be smart." He walked past her toward the door, then paused. "Oh, and Aurora? Tomorrow's ceremony is black tie. Your little purple dress won't do. Stay in the staff areas where you belong." Then he was gone, and Aurora was alone in the massive library, shaking with rage and fear and something else, something harder that was forming in the center of her chest like a stone. She stood there for a long time, staring at the envelope full of money that was meant to buy her silence. Then she walked over to the desk, picked up the envelope, and put it in her bag. Not because she had decided to take the bribe, but because she wanted Edric to think she might. She wanted him to feel safe, to think he had won, to believe she would disappear quietly. Because Aurora was realizing something important. Edric had brought her here to humiliate her, to prove his power over her. But in doing so, he had given her something valuable. He had put her in the same building where his wedding would happen, where all his important friends and colleagues would gather, where his carefully constructed image would be on full display. He had given her access. And access was opportunity. Aurora left the library and found her way back to the small staff room where Margaret had said she could sleep. It was simple, a single bed, a small bathroom, but it was clean and quiet. She sat on the bed and opened her laptop, connecting to the estate's Wi-Fi. She started searching. She logged into the old email account she and Edric had shared during their marriage, an account he had probably forgotten existed. She scrolled back through years of messages, looking for anything that might be useful. And she found things. Messages from 2 years ago where Edric discussed with his campaign manager how to handle his divorce without it affecting his image. Messages where he explicitly instructed people to remove Aurora from photographs and documents. Messages where he referred to her as an embarrassment, a liability, a mistake he needed to erase. She took screenshots of everything. Then she kept searching. She found messages between Edric and Seraphine's father, messages from 6 months ago where Edric was clearly courting the relationship, positioning himself as the perfect match for Seraphine. In one message, Seraphine's father asked directly, "You've never been married before, correct? My daughter values honesty above all else." And Edric had replied, "Never married. My record is completely clean." A lie. A documented, provable lie. Aurora saved everything. Then she opened a new browser and searched for contact information. She found the name of the estate's audio-visual coordinator, someone named Marcus Chin, whose email was listed on a staff directory. She composed a message. "Hello, Marcus. I'm Aurora Hemsley, working as the archival consultant this weekend. I have some historical documents and photographs related to Mr. Vale's background that I'd like to include in tomorrow's tribute presentation. Would you be able to help me arrange for these materials to be displayed on the screens during the reception? I can send the files to you tonight. Thank you for your assistance." She sent the email before she could second-guess herself. Then she pulled out her phone and called the only friend she had left, a woman named Jasmine who she had known in university, who had gone into broadcast journalism. They hadn't spoken in over a year. Aurora had let the friendship die during her marriage, just like all the others. But she had to try. Jasmine answered on the third ring. "Aurora? Is that you?" Aurora's voice shook. "Jazz, I need a favor. A big one. Can you come to Marbridge Estate tomorrow? I can't explain everything over the phone, but something is going to happen and I need someone there who can document it." There was a pause. Then Jasmine said, slowly, "Are you in trouble?" "Not the kind you're thinking. But I need help. Please." Another pause. Then, "Okay. Text me the address. I'll be there." Aurora texted the information, then sat on the bed, her heart pounding. She had just set something in motion, something she couldn't take back. She didn't know exactly what would happen tomorrow. She didn't have a detailed plan. But she knew that Edric had spent 6 months erasing her, and tomorrow, in front of everyone he wanted to impress, she was going to make sure they all knew her name. She lay down on the narrow bed, one hand on her belly where her baby was moving, kicking gently. She whispered, "I'm sorry you're being born into this mess. But I promise you, I won't let him define us. I won't disappear. She barely slept that night. Every hour she woke up with anxiety twisting her stomach, wondering if she was making a huge mistake, wondering if Edric really would destroy her if she went through with this. But every time she thought about backing down, she thought about Seraphine's kind face, about the lie that woman was walking into, about every future woman Edric would use and discard because he had learned he could get away with it. By the time morning light filtered through the small window, Aurora had made her decision. She wasn't taking Edric's money. She wasn't staying silent. Whatever happened next, she would face it standing up. Saturday morning, the estate exploded with activity. Florists arrived with more white flowers. Caterers unloaded trucks full of food. Musicians set up in the ballroom. Hairstylists and makeup artists commandeered entire rooms. The wedding was scheduled for 3 in the afternoon, with a reception to follow immediately after in the grand ballroom. Aurora stayed in her small archive room, working on the displays she had been hired to create, but now with a different purpose. She selected photographs of Edric carefully, choosing ones that showed his rise, but avoiding anything that would reveal what she was planning. She wanted everything to look normal, professional, exactly what he would expect. At noon, Marcus Chin, the audio-visual coordinator, knocked on her door. He was young, maybe 25, with tired eyes and the frazzled expression of someone who had been working too many hours. He said, "I got your email. You have materials to add to the presentation?" Aurora handed him a USB drive. Just a few photographs and documents for the tribute segment. Historical context. Nothing fancy. Marcus took the drive without really looking at it. He was too busy juggling 3 other tasks. "Okay, I'll load these onto the system. They'll display when Mr. Vale gives his tribute speech during the reception." "Thank you," Aurora said. Marcus nodded and left. Aurora sat back down, her hands trembling. The files on that USB drive weren't historical context. They were the emails, the screenshots, the proof of everything Edric had done. Once Marcus loaded them onto the system, they would be in the presentation queue. All Aurora had to do was find a way to trigger them at the right moment. At 2 o'clock, guests started arriving. Aurora watched from a hallway window as expensive cars pulled up, disgorging diplomats, politicians, society figures, all dressed in designer clothes, all smiling and chatting and sipping champagne. She recognized faces from news broadcasts, people whose names appeared in newspaper articles, people who controlled policy and money and influence. At 3 o'clock, the ceremony began. Aurora didn't watch it directly, but she could hear the music, the readings, the murmur of hundreds of people gathered in the estate's grand chapel. She heard the moment when they were pronounced married, heard the applause and cheers. She stood in her small archive room, wearing her purple dress because she had nothing else, and felt a strange calm settle over her. The reception started at 4. Guests moved from the chapel to the ballroom, a massive space with crystal chandeliers, polished marble floors, round tables covered in white linens. An orchestra played. Champagne flowed. The energy was celebratory, opulent, everything a high society wedding should be. Aurora stayed hidden in the hallways, watching through doorways. She saw Edric and Seraphine make their entrance, saw him in his burgundy suit with black lapels, saw her in a stunning white gown with gold embroidery, both of them glowing, both of them perfect. Dinner was served. Speeches began. The best man told funny stories about Edric's diplomatic mishaps. The maid of honor cried while talking about Seraphine's kindness. Everyone laughed and applauded at the right moments. It was all so normal, so beautiful. And then the master of ceremonies announced, and now, Edric would like to honor some special contributors to his journey. Aurora's heart started pounding. This was the moment Edric had planned for her humiliation. She knew it. She had been dreading it. But she was ready. Edric stood up, took the microphone, and smiled that polished smile. He thanked politicians, mentors, family members. Each person stood and waved, basking in the attention. Then Edric said, his voice smooth and charming, and I'd like to acknowledge someone else. Someone who taught me what I didn't want in life. Aurora, could you come up here? The room went quiet. Heads turned, searching for whoever Aurora was. No one knew her. She had been erased so completely that her name meant nothing to anyone in that room. Aurora stepped out from the hallway. She walked across the ballroom floor, her purple dress flowing, her pregnant belly visible to everyone. She heard gasps, heard whispers. She saw Seraphine's confused expression. She saw Edric smile, confident and cruel, thinking this was going exactly as he planned. She climbed the steps to the small stage area where Edric stood. She faced him, faced the hundreds of people watching. Edric spoke into the microphone. Aurora here was well, let's call her a phase. A learning experience. He paused for laughter. Some people obliged. She helped me with some early tasks. Filing, organizing, the kind of work anyone could do. Nothing special. Aurora stood silent, watching him perform. But Aurora had some trouble letting go, Edric continued. Even showed up here, heavily pregnant, hoping to, what? Rekindle something? His tone was mocking, pitying. Then he placed his hand on Aurora's shoulder. To the crowd, he said, "This is what desperation looks like, friends." And then, in a move that made several people gasp, Edric grabbed the fabric of Aurora's dress at the shoulder. Aurora tried to pull back, but he held firm and yanked hard. The dress ripped from shoulder to waist with a sound like thunder in the silent ballroom. The fabric tore completely, exposing Aurora's pregnant belly, her simple maternity bra, her vulnerability to everyone. Camera phones came out. Flashes went off. People gasped, some in shock, some in uncomfortable amusement. Aurora stood there, clutching the torn fabric to her body, humiliated in front of 400 people. Edric stepped back, feigning concern. "Oh dear," she stumbled. Someone help the poor woman. Aurora stood there, torn dress clutched to her chest, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes on her exposed body. She heard whispers, heard someone laugh nervously. She saw Seraphine stand up from the head table, her face pale with shock. This was the moment Edric expected Aurora to break. To run. To cry. To confirm everything he had said about her being desperate and pathetic. Instead, Aurora reached out and took the microphone from Edric's hand. Her voice shook at first, then grew stronger. "You're right, Edric. I should introduce myself properly to your guests." Edric's confident smile faltered. Aurora turned to face the crowd. "My name is Aurora Hemsley Vale." "Yes, Vale. We were married for 4 years. Not a phase. Not a learning experience. I was his wife." The room erupted in whispers. Heads turned toward each other, confused murmurs growing louder. Aurora continued, her voice gaining power. "I worked 3 jobs to pay for his education. I used my inheritance to fund his first campaign. I wrote his speeches. I coached his interviews. I built the man you see before you." Edric lunged for the microphone. "She's delusional. Security." But Aurora held on. "I got pregnant 6 months ago. He divorced me to hide me from his new life. He left me with nothing." Edric grabbed her arm, trying to pull her away from the microphone, but Aurora's voice rang out. "He told Seraphine he had never been married. He lied to everyone." Seraphine stood, her face a mask of shock and betrayal. "What is she talking about?" And then, as if on cue, the massive screens around the ballroom that had been displaying wedding photos suddenly changed. Marcus had loaded Aurora's files into the system, and now they were cycling through automatically, triggered by the presentation software. Email after email appeared on the screens, blown up to massive size so everyone could read them. From Edric to his lawyer, make sure the pregnancy never becomes public knowledge. Pay whatever it takes to keep her silent. From Edric to a colleague, married? Me? To that nobody? Please. I'm building an empire, not running a charity. From Edric to Seraphine's father, never been married. My record is completely clean. The screen cycled through message after message. Edric calling Aurora an embarrassment. Edric instructing staff to erase her from photographs. Edric planning exactly how to destroy her credibility if she ever spoke up. The ballroom descended into chaos. Guests pulled out their phones, recording everything. Diplomats stood up, heading toward exits. Seraphine stood frozen, staring at the screens, tears streaming down her face. Edric, desperate now, shouted, "Those are fake." She doctored those emails. But people were already verifying. Someone shouted, "That's your email address. I recognize it." Chapter 3. The ballroom had become something else entirely, something ugly and raw where moments before it had been elegant and controlled. The orchestra had stopped playing. Waiters stood frozen with champagne bottles. 400 guests who had come to celebrate a wedding were now witnesses to its destruction, and every single one of them had their phones out, recording, photographing, capturing every moment of Edric Vale's carefully constructed life coming apart. Aurora stood on that stage, still clutching her torn purple dress to her chest, watching the screen cycle through emails that proved everything she had said. She saw faces in the crowd shifting from confusion to shock to disgust. She saw the foreign minister, a stern woman in her 60s who had been planning to endorse Edric for deputy minister, stand up and walk toward the exit without a word. She saw campaign donors gathering in urgent huddles. She saw journalists, proper ones with press credentials, pushing toward the front with cameras and recording devices. And she saw Seraphine. The bride stood at the head table, still in her stunning white gown with gold embroidery, her face a portrait of devastation. She wasn't looking at Aurora. She was looking at Edric, and the betrayal in her eyes was absolute. She had walked into this marriage believing she was marrying an honest man, a man who shared her values, a man who had been truthful about his past. And in the span of 5 minutes, she had discovered it was all a lie. Seraphine walked across the ballroom floor. Her steps were measured, controlled, despite the chaos around her. She walked right up to the stage where Aurora and Edric stood. She looked first at Edric, her voice shaking but clear. "You told me you had never been married. You looked my father in the eye and lied. You looked me in the eye and lied." Edric reached for her. "Seraphine, please, she's manipulating you. Those emails are fake. She's trying to destroy us." Seraphine pulled back from his touch. "I recognize your email address, Edric. I've received messages from that address. I know your writing style. I know your words." She turned to look at the screens, which were now showing a message where Edric had written to a colleague, "My starter wife is finally gone. Time for an upgrade." Seraphine's voice broke. "Is that what I am? An upgrade?" Edric's face shifted through several emotions: desperation, anger, calculation. He seemed to be searching for the right words, the right angle, the way to spin this back in his favor. But nothing came. His silver tongue, his polished charm, all of it had abandoned him. Seraphine turned to Aurora. She looked at the torn dress, at Aurora's pregnant belly, at the dignity Aurora was trying so hard to maintain despite her humiliation. Then Seraphine did something that would be captured in dozens of photographs and videos, something that would be shared thousands of times on social media in the hours to come. She removed her wedding shawl, an exquisite silk wrap embroidered with gold thread, and draped it around Aurora's shoulders, covering her torn dress. She said, quietly but clearly enough for the microphones to catch, "I will not marry a coward. I will not build a life with a liar." She took off her wedding ring, the one Edric had placed on her finger less than 2 hours ago, and set it on the stage floor. Then she walked away, her head high, her spine straight, leaving Edric standing there with his mouth open and no words coming out. The ballroom erupted. People were shouting questions at Edric. Cameras flashed like lightning. Security guards were trying to control the crowd but failing. And Aurora, wrapped in Seraphine's shawl, stood in the center of the storm feeling something she hadn't felt in months. Not quite triumph, but something close. Vindication. Proof that she hadn't been crazy, hadn't been dramatic, hadn't been a bitter ex-wife making things up. She had been telling the truth, and now everyone knew it. Edric finally seemed to recover his voice. He pointed at Aurora, his face twisted with rage. "You've destroyed everything. Everything I built." Aurora looked at him, at this man who had taken 4 years of her life, and tried to erase her like she was a mistake to be corrected. She said, her voice steady, "No, Edric. You destroyed yourself. I just showed people what was always there." Security finally reached the stage. But they weren't there for Aurora. They were there because the chaos in the ballroom had become unmanageable, and someone needed to clear the space. A senior security officer spoke into his radio, then said to Edric, "Sir, we need you to come with us. There are some people who need to speak with you." Edric looked around wildly, as if searching for an escape route. But there was none. Every exit had people with cameras. Every face in the crowd looked at him with contempt or pity or schadenfreude. His perfect wedding, his perfect image, his perfect future, all of it had collapsed in less than 10 minutes. As security escorted him off the stage, he passed close to Aurora. He hissed, quiet enough that only she could hear, "I will destroy you for this. You have no idea what I'm capable of." Aurora looked him in the eye and said, just as quietly, "I already know what you're capable of. That's why I'm not afraid of you anymore." Then he was gone, and Aurora was left standing on the stage alone, wrapped in a bride's shawl, watching the chaos she had created. Jasmine appeared at the edge of the stage, her camera around her neck, her face flushed with adrenaline. She climbed up and pulled Aurora into a tight hug. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Oh my God, Aurora. That was the bravest thing I've ever seen." Aurora let herself be hugged, let herself feel for just a moment the support of someone who cared about her. Then she pulled back. "Did you get it? Did you record everything?" "Every second," Jasmine said. "And trust me, this is going to be everywhere by tonight. This is international news." Aurora felt a wave of exhaustion hit her. Her legs felt weak. Her baby was kicking hard, responding to her elevated heart rate and stress. She needed to sit down. She needed to breathe. Margaret appeared beside them, her face full of concern and something that looked like pride. "Come with me, dear. Let's get you somewhere quiet." Aurora let Margaret guide her off the stage, through a side door, away from the ballroom and the cameras and the chaos. They walked through quiet hallways until they reached a small sitting room with comfortable chairs and windows that looked out on the gardens. Margaret brought water and made Aurora sit down. "You did something extraordinary," Margaret said quietly. "Something that needed to be done." Aurora looked down at her hands, which were shaking. "I just told the truth. Sometimes that's the most revolutionary thing a person can do." They sat in silence for a while. Aurora could hear sirens in the distance, could hear raised voices echoing through the estate. She pulled Seraphine's shawl tighter around herself, felt the silk against her skin, and thought about that moment when the bride had covered her, had chosen solidarity over her own wedding. After about 30 minutes, there was a knock on the door. Aurora tensed, thinking it might be Edric or his lawyers. But when Margaret opened the door, it was Seraphine. The bride had changed out of her wedding gown. She now wore simple clothes, jeans and a soft sweater, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She looked younger without all the wedding glamour, more vulnerable. Her eyes were red from crying. "May I come in?" she asked. Aurora nodded. Seraphine sat down in the chair across from Aurora. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Seraphine said, "I owe you an apology." Aurora shook her head. "You didn't know." "I should have known. I should have asked harder questions. I should have verified things instead of just believing him." Seraphine's voice cracked. "He was so convincing. So sincere. I thought I knew him." "He's very good at being what people need him to be," Aurora said. "That's his greatest talent." Seraphine wiped her eyes. "My father is outside right now, tearing up the prenuptial agreement and making calls to ensure Edric never works in diplomatic circles again. The foreign minister released a statement 20 minutes ago saying his endorsement is permanently withdrawn. His campaign donors are demanding refunds." She looked at Aurora. "What he did to you, ripping your dress, that's assault. The police are here. They want your statement." Aurora felt her throat tighten. "Will it matter? He has expensive lawyers. Important friends. Not anymore, he doesn't. You broke his power when you told the truth. People saw what he really is. Friends and lawyers can't fix that." There was another silence. Then Seraphine said, "What are you going to do now?" Aurora looked down at her belly, at the baby who would be born in a few weeks. "I don't know. I still don't have a job. I still don't have money. Telling the truth doesn't change those things." Seraphine reached into her bag and pulled out a business card. She wrote something on the back, then handed it to Aurora. "That's my lawyer's number. He's one of the best in the country, and he's agreed to represent you pro bono. He'll make sure Edric pays child support, covers medical expenses, all of it. And that," she pointed to what she had written on the back, "is my personal number. Call me when you're ready. I want to help." Aurora stared at the card, not quite believing what she was hearing. "Why would you help me? I just destroyed your wedding. You saved me from making the biggest mistake of my life. That's not something I'll forget." Seraphine stood up. "I have to go deal with the aftermath. But, Aurora, what you did today, standing up like that, it mattered. Not just for you, but for every woman who's been erased by a powerful man. You made him face consequences. That's rare." After Seraphine left, Aurora sat alone in the quiet sitting room, holding the business card, feeling something shift inside her. For 6 months, she had felt like a victim, like someone things happened to, someone with no power and no options. But standing on that stage, exposing the truth, watching Edric's world collapse, she had remembered something important. She had a voice. She had agency. And she could choose to use both. Over the next hours, as evening turned to night, the scope of what had happened became clear. Jasmine's video went viral immediately, shared tens of thousands of times on social media with hashtags like "Tell Her Truth and Justice for Aurora." News outlets picked up the story. By midnight, it was international news. The wedding scandal involving a rising diplomatic star who had secretly divorced his pregnant wife became one of those rare stories that captured public attention completely. Aurora's phone, which she had kept on silent in her bag, was flooded with messages. Reporters requesting interviews. Women's organizations offering support. Lawyers offering to take her case. Random people sending messages of encouragement. It was overwhelming, but it was also proof that she was no longer invisible. On Sunday morning, Aurora prepared to leave Marbridge Estate. She had barely slept, kept awake by adrenaline and anxiety and her baby's constant movement. She packed her small bag, returned to the archive room one last time to make sure she had collected all her belongings. She found the envelope Edric had given her, the one with £10,000 meant to buy her silence. She hadn't touched the money. She left the envelope on the desk with a note that said, "I'm not for sale." As she was leaving, she saw Edric one final time. He was in a corridor with his lawyers, 3 men in expensive suits having an urgent conversation. When he saw Aurora, his face filled with such hatred that she actually stepped back. He broke away from his lawyers and cornered her. His voice was low and venomous. "You think you've won? You think destroying me makes you powerful? I will sue you for defamation. I will prove those emails were faked. I will make sure you never work again. I'll make sure your child grows up knowing their mother is a liar who destroyed their father out of spite." Aurora looked at him, at this man who still thought he could threaten his way back to power. She said, calmly, "Those emails came from your own account, Edric. They're verified. Multiple journalists have confirmed their authenticity. You can't spin your way out of truth. And my child will grow up knowing their mother had the courage to stand up to a man who tried to erase her. That's a better legacy than anything you'll leave." Edric opened his mouth to respond, but one of his lawyers called him back. As he walked away, Aurora heard him still trying to strategize, still trying to find an angle, still believing he could talk his way back to respectability. Margaret drove Aurora to the train station herself. Before Aurora got out of the car, the older woman pressed an envelope into her hands. "That's from the staff," she said. "We all contributed. It's not much, but it's something." Inside was £2,000 in cash and a note signed by 24 staff members. For the brave woman who told the truth. Aurora cried then, sitting in Margaret's car in the train station parking lot, crying not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that people, strangers, cared. That what she had done mattered to more than just herself. The train ride home felt different than the journey there. Aurora was still pregnant, still broke, still facing an uncertain future. But she was no longer carrying shame. She was no longer invisible. She existed, fully and completely, and everyone knew it. Back in her tiny studio flat, Aurora spent the next week in a strange kind of limbo. The story continued to dominate news cycles. Edric's political career was officially over. The Foreign Relations Office released a statement saying he had been placed on indefinite leave pending an ethics investigation. His campaign organization dissolved. Several of his colleagues released statements distancing themselves from him. Seraphine's lawyer, a sharp man named Thomas Fairweather, contacted Aurora and began building a case for child support and damages. He explained that Edric would be required to pay substantial support, would be required to cover all medical expenses related to the pregnancy and birth, and could potentially face civil suits for emotional distress and assault. But more than the legal victories, something else happened. Women started reaching out to Aurora. Dozens at first, then hundreds. Women who had been abandoned by partners during pregnancy. Women who had supported men through school or career advancement only to be discarded. Women whose stories had been erased by powerful men. They sent messages, letters, emails. They said thank you. They said you gave me courage. They said I'm not alone anymore. Aurora realized that her personal nightmare had become something larger. It had become a moment that mattered to people beyond herself. 2 weeks after the wedding, Aurora went into labor. It was terrifying, being alone in a hospital with no partner, no family, just herself. But Seraphine showed up. The woman who should have hated Aurora instead sat with her through 14 hours of labor, held her hand, coached her breathing, and was there when Aurora's son was born. Aurora named him Alistair. He was small and perfect, with tiny fists and a loud cry that announced his arrival to the world. When the nurse placed him in Aurora's arms, she looked down at this new life and made a promise. "I will never let anyone make you feel like you're not important. I will never let anyone erase you from your own story. In the weeks after Alistair's birth, while Aurora was adjusting to motherhood in her tiny flat, surviving on donated supplies and Seraphine's continued support, something unexpected happened. A woman named Dr. Imani Okafor, who ran a nonprofit supporting vulnerable mothers, reached out with a proposal. "Your story has resonated with so many people," Dr. Okafor said during a phone call. "People want to help, and they want to help women in situations like yours. Have you thought about creating an organization? A network to support abandoned pregnant women, to provide resources, to fight for accountability?" Aurora, exhausted and still recovering from childbirth, said, "I don't know how to run an organization. I'm a historian, not an activist." Dr. Okafor laughed. "You're a survivor who stood up to power. That's better than any degree. And you wouldn't be alone. There are dozens of people ready to help. Lawyers, social workers, donors. Your story started something. Now you can build something from it." It took Aurora 3 weeks to make the decision. But finally, sitting in her tiny flat with Alistair asleep in a donated crib, she called Dr. Okafor back and said yes. They called it Heartkeepers United. The mission was simple: to provide support, resources, and advocacy for women who had been abandoned during pregnancy or coerced into silence by powerful partners. They offered legal assistance, financial support, housing help, emotional counseling. They also tracked patterns of abuse, exposing men who serially abandoned pregnant partners and using public pressure to force accountability. The crowdfunding campaign to get Heartkeepers United off the ground raised £200,000 in the first week. Women, and many men too, donated whatever they could. Some gave £5, some gave thousands. They all said the same thing: this matters. 6 months after the wedding that wasn't, Aurora stood in a small office space in central London, surrounded by filing cabinets full of case files, walls covered with resource information, and a team of 5 staff members who had dedicated themselves to the cause. Heartkeepers United had helped 127 women in its first 6 months. They had secured child support orders against 43 absent fathers. They had provided emergency housing for 18 women. They had connected dozens more with legal resources, therapy, job placement services. Aurora looked around the office, baby Alistair strapped to her chest in a carrier, and felt something she hadn't felt in over a year. Purpose. Not just survival, but actual meaning in her life. Her phone buzzed. A news alert. Edric Vale pleads guilty to assault charges, ordered to pay damages and child support. The trial had been quick. The video evidence was too clear, too damning. Edric had finally run out of ways to spin the narrative. He had pleaded guilty to avoid a longer trial, agreed to pay Aurora £75,000 in damages plus monthly child support. His lawyers had negotiated that he wouldn't face jail time, but his reputation was destroyed beyond repair. Aurora read the headline and felt not joy, but a quiet kind of closure. She didn't need Edric to be in prison. She just needed him to face consequences, to have his actions matter, to not be able to walk away from what he had done without any cost. A month later, Aurora received an invitation she hadn't expected. The National Women's Leadership Conference wanted her as a keynote speaker. 2,000 women from across the country would be there. They wanted to hear her story. Aurora almost said no. She wasn't a public speaker. She was just a woman who had told the truth when it mattered. But then she thought about all the messages she had received, all the women who had said your story gave me courage. She thought about how silence had almost destroyed her, and how speaking up had saved her. She said yes. On the day of the conference, Aurora stood backstage at a massive convention center, listening to the roar of 2,000 women on the other side of the curtain. She wore a purple dress, not the one Edric had torn, but a new one, the same color, a deliberate choice. She had reclaimed that color. It no longer represented her humiliation. It represented her courage. Alistair was with a caregiver in the wings, 6 months old now, giggling and grabbing at everything. Aurora kissed his forehead before walking on stage. The applause when she appeared was deafening. 2,000 women standing, clapping, some crying, all of them there because something about her story had resonated with something in theirs. Aurora stood at the podium, looked out at the sea of faces, and began to speak. When they try to tear you apart, they forget something crucial. They reveal the strength of what remains. They expose the truth they tried to bury. They create space for new buildings where they meant to leave rubble. She paused, her voice steady and strong. My ex-husband ripped my dress to humiliate me. Instead, he ripped away the illusion that my worth was tied to his approval. He tried to erase me from history, and in doing so, He made sure everyone would remember my name. The applause was thunderous. Aurora continued. For 4 years, I believed that my purpose was to support someone else's dreams. I worked 3 jobs, gave away my inheritance, sacrificed my own ambitions so he could achieve his. And when he succeeded, he discarded me like I was disposable. For months after, I believed I was nothing, that my life had no value beyond what I could give to someone else. She looked down at her hands, then back up at the crowd. But standing on that stage at his wedding, with my dress torn and my dignity stripped, I realized something. I had never been nothing. I had been everything. I had been smart enough to get him through school, strong enough to work multiple jobs, creative enough to write speeches that moved people, resilient enough to survive betrayal and poverty and abandonment while carrying a child. All of that had always been mine. He didn't give me those qualities. He just borrowed them for a while. Women in the audience were crying, nodding, some standing again. Aurora's voice grew stronger. So to every woman who has been told she's nothing without a man, who has poured herself into someone else's dream only to be discarded when she was no longer useful, who has been erased from her own story by someone who wanted to look self-made, I want you to hear this. You were never nothing. You were always everything. And when they try to tear you down, use that moment to show everyone exactly who you are. The standing ovation lasted 5 full minutes. Aurora stood at that podium, tears running down her face, feeling the weight of every message, every woman who had reached out, every story that paralleled her own. This was why she had stood up. This was why it had mattered. After the speech, dozens of women lined up to talk to her, to thank her, to share their own stories. Aurora listened to each one, hugged strangers, cried with women she had never met but who felt like sisters. And in the back of the room, standing quietly against the wall, was Seraphine. She had come to hear Aurora speak. When their eyes met, Seraphine smiled and raised a hand in acknowledgement. Aurora smiled back. 2 women who had almost been destroyed by the same man, now both rebuilding, both standing. As Aurora left the convention center that evening, Alistair in her arms, she passed a newsstand. The headline caught her eye. Former rising political star Edric Vale now working in private sector, career in ruins. The article detailed how Edric had been forced to take a low-level job at a consulting firm, how his name was now associated with scandal rather than promise, how he had become a cautionary tale about the consequences of cruelty. Aurora read the first paragraph, then kept walking. She didn't need to know the details of his fall. His story was no longer relevant to hers. That night, back in her flat, which wasn't quite as tiny anymore thanks to Hearthkeepers United paying her a modest salary, Aurora sat in a rocking chair feeding Alistair. She looked at her son's face, his tiny features, his complete trust in her, and felt grateful not for the easy parts of her story, but for having survived the hard parts. Her phone buzzed. A message from Jasmine. Turn on the news. Channel 4. Aurora switched on her small television. A segment was playing about Hearthkeepers United. They interviewed 3 women the organization had helped. Each woman told her story of abandonment, of how Hearthkeepers had provided support when they had nowhere else to turn. The news anchor said, in just 8 months, this grassroots organization has become one of the most effective advocates for vulnerable mothers in the country, all started by one woman who refused to be silent. They showed a clip of Aurora's speech from the conference. Aurora watched herself on screen, in her purple dress, speaking with a confidence she still sometimes didn't recognize. That woman on TV looked powerful. She looked unbroken. Aurora turned off the television and looked down at Alistair, who had fallen asleep in her arms. She whispered, "Your father tried to make me disappear. But instead, I became impossible to ignore. And that's what I'm going to teach you. That your voice matters. That truth is more powerful than image. That cruelty can be defeated by courage." She carried her sleeping son to his crib, laid him down gently, and stood watching him breathe. In the quiet of that moment, Aurora understood that her story wasn't a tragedy with a redemption arc. It was something more complex. It was a story about a woman who had been torn apart and had used the pieces to build something entirely new. Not better than before, necessarily, but true. Authentic. Hers. And that was enough. Months continued to pass. Hearthkeepers United grew. They opened a second office. They hired more staff. They helped hundreds more women. Aurora became a recognized voice in advocacy circles, invited to speak at conferences, to advise on policy, to consult with organizations working on similar issues. And Edric faded. Not dramatically, but slowly, inevitably. His name stopped appearing in news articles. His social media went quiet. The friends who had once surrounded him moved on to supporting other rising stars. He became what he had tried to make Aurora, invisible. On Alistair's first birthday, Aurora threw a small party in her flat, now a proper one-bedroom apartment in a safer neighborhood. Seraphine came, bringing an enormous stuffed bear. Jasmine came with her camera, documenting everything. Margaret came, having stayed in touch since that weekend at Marbridge Estate. Dr. Okafor came with her husband. The small apartment was full of women who had survived their own battles, who had chosen to support each other rather than compete. As Aurora lit the candle on Alistair's birthday cake, her son giggling and reaching for the flame, she thought about that moment on the stage at Edric's wedding. That moment when her dress had been torn, when she had been exposed and humiliated in front of hundreds of people. That moment had felt like the worst of her life. But it hadn't been an ending. It had been a beginning. Because in that moment, Aurora had made a choice. She could run and hide, or she could stand and speak. She could let Edric's narrative define her, or she could tell her own story. She could disappear into shame, or she could become undeniable. She had chosen to be undeniable. And in doing so, she had given other women permission to do the same. The candle flickered. Alistair clapped his small hands. The room full of women sang happy birthday, their voices joining together in celebration of this small life, this new beginning, this proof that something beautiful could emerge from something painful. Aurora closed her eyes and made a wish. Not for revenge, not for justice, not even for healing. She wished for continued courage. For herself, for her son, for every woman still finding her voice. Then she opened her eyes, helped Alistair blow out the candle, and watched as everyone cheered. The story could have ended there with a neat bow, with everything resolved. But life isn't neat. So Aurora's story continued, as all real stories do, with ups and downs, with good days and hard days, with victories and setbacks. But the fundamental truth remained: she had survived. She had spoken. She had mattered. And no one, not Edric, not anyone, could ever take that away from her again.